Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast is a Christ-centered podcast. Established in 2019 and hosted weekly by Pastor Chris Busher. Addressing a host of topics such as the Great Commission, Christian discipleship, and often featuring interviews with special guests who are experts in their field. The views and events expressed on this podcast and all related materials belong solely to their author and not necessarily to the author's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. While all attempts are made to present accurate information, some information may become outdated over time. Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast makes every attempt to timely update any and all such information. Without further delay, here's another powerful episode of Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dallas Montague. It's great to be back here in the studio today. It's actually been, I think, a few weeks since I've been recording. It's been pretty crazy here in my life in Brazil. Just a quick story. Recently, I found out that I was illegal here in Brazil, and it's been a crazy process for me. They changed the law in Brazil, and so I didn't have to have a visa. And recently, I went to the federal police station to try to see what I needed to do with my situation, and they gave me a fine and said I had 30 days to become legal. And it's been literally the most crazy thing I've ever done in my entire life. I've had to go to different places in the city. I've had to take the train 2 hours one direction, get in a train and take it 2 hours the other direction, go to this federal building, go to that federal building, trying to solve this problem. And so I apologize for you guys for not putting out other podcasts. It's been pretty sad. I just got some new equipment too. And so this is my first podcast with my new equipment. So I'm really excited about this podcast today and moving forward. So thank you guys so much for your faithfulness. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. And I really look forward to our podcast today with George Sisneros. Before we get started, I just want to share a quick testimony. This past Sunday, I preached a message at a church about knowing God. And my whole life, I believed that I knew God. And I grew up from a pretty young age knowing God, going to church, raising my hands up in worship, praying to God, those things. And I knew who God was. And then later in my life, a part of my testimony is some of you may know, I turned to drugs. And that kind of directed my life for a few years, and it really changed everything. It changed my family situation. It changed my life. Really, it changed my life in a horrible, horrible way. And eventually I turned back to God, and he changed my life again. And now I'm serving God as a missionary. But about that story is I thought that I knew God. And I think it's a lie that we believe in the church, that it's just good enough to go to church. It's good enough to just go to church and to be a Christian. But I really believe that there's more than that. I really believe that there's another level on top of just going to church. We're not called to look like a church. We're not called to just go to church. We're called to look like Jesus. And so this past Sunday, I preached a message at a church called There's Levels to This. And I was talking about Matthew chapter 13, when Jesus says that he had little honor in his hometown because of their lack of faith, because they knew Jesus. And I think so many times we're so used to that. Like we grew up in the church. It's common to go to church, and just sit in the church, all those things. But what really hit me is that those people, their lack of faith is because they thought that they knew Jesus. And Jesus wasn't allowed to do many miracles there. It doesn't say that he was able to do any. It just says he wasn't able to do many. And so I believe that there's another level. I believe that there's some people that went past just going to church. I believe there were some people who went past just knowing the scriptures. And I think there's levels to this, really. I think level 1 in our life is just living outside of the will of God. And I think level 2 is living in the permissive will of God, where God allows, but he doesn't prefer. It's a place in our life that says salvation, but not transformation. It's a place that says, I'm not where I used to be, but I'm not where I should be. And so many times we stay in that place of just salvation because we don't experience transformation. We get in this place where we think that we know God and that's it. I go to church, I raise my hands, I pray every night. And I did that too for many, many, many years. And I was still a drug addict. I was still in a life of drugs and sin. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's more, no matter how old you are, no matter what country you grew up in, no matter what language you speak, there's still more for you. Maybe you go to church every Sunday and Wednesday and you serve in the church, and maybe your dad's a pastor or you used to be an elder, whatever the case may be, there's still more for you. And so I just want to give you this message before we get into the podcast with George Sisneros today, is that there's still more. There's still higher levels for you. Never be content with just where you are. I'm in a time in my life that I just shared that it's a crazy, crazy time in my life right now, living in a country that's not my own, a language that I don't speak. They speak Portuguese here in Brazil. And it's just been the hardest thing I've ever done. Really, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. And there's still more. There's still higher levels for me to go. Yes, I've been serving God this entire year doing missions, but there's still more for me. There's still more. And I'm really excited about this podcast today with George Sisneros. George is a missionary in Guatemala, and he moved his entire family to Guatemala 8 years ago. And he's adopted 4 children in Guatemala. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear about his testimony, about the times, his stories there, the ministry that he started there, Ordinary Ministries. And before we get to it, I'm going to give you a quick word from our sponsors, and then we'll jump right on with George. Thank you.
You're listening to the Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsors.
After working as an engineer in a nuclear power plant division, Christian apologist M.C. Talbot accepted the call of God in his life to become a preacher and instructor in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He has served in California and Maryland and continues to serve God's people in the great city of Orlando, Florida. Reverend Talbot has the right book for you. Whether you are a Christian new in your walk or not, his new book, Courageous Christianity for the 21st Century, An Introduction to Basic Christian Theology, will refresh and inspire you. Check out this book and others on his website, www.studyyourfaith.org.
Are you looking for the best and easiest way to make money online? Join Robbie Blanchard in a free training at linctrader.com. That's linctrader.com. In this free training, Robbie will show you how to generate a passive income promoting informative products that people are just dying to use. Zero experience necessary to become a success with this system. Contact Robbie at linctrader.com today. You're not going to want to miss this free training.
George, how are you today?
Hey, Dallas. I am good. Thanks.
It's great to have you here in the studio today. You're a missionary in Guatemala, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
I'm excited to talk with you today about our conversations about your time in Guatemala. You and your wife went to Guatemala about 7.5 years ago, and I've been in Brazil for almost 5 months now, and so I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
To begin our podcast, can you just open up with your testimony, about 5 to 10 minutes, maybe in the beginning, of what led you to Jesus?
Wow. What led me to Jesus? It's crazy because I feel like I grew up my whole life as a Christian. And I think what I felt that meant at the time was just, going to church as often as I could, praying before meals and trying not to sin a lot. Like that was kind of what I felt was my Christian life. But actually what happened was, I would say it was about 9 years ago. So it was 2010, November. I was just sitting alone in my basement. I remember I was watching my favorite football team, the Denver Broncos, and they just lost a game. And so I turned the TV off. I was just sitting in my basement. And I don't know why God chose to talk to me that day, but that day he chose to talk to me. And I will say that that's not something that has happened a lot or happens a lot, but I really felt God asking me, "Do you love me?" Mm-hmm. And I'm like, "Of course."
And George, can I ask you a question about that?
Of course.
Was that an audible voice, or was that a in your heart voice?
No, it wasn't audible. It was just that was just a feeling that I was having. I felt like God was talking to me. It was this conversation I was having, really through my spirit, I guess, through my heart.
Yeah, I had to ask because some people have some amazing testimonies of God audibly spoke to me in a voice. I'm like, okay, I got to know. So thank you. Keep going.
No, that's all right. So, do you love me? And my knee-jerk reaction is, of course I love you. But then he asked me, do you love me more than you love your wife? And wow. I paused and, I know you have a girlfriend right now and, how much time, you love to spend time with her. I love spending time with my wife. We have coffee every morning. We cry with each other, we laugh with each other. And so, I obviously I want to be honest with God. And I said, I love my wife more than I love you. And then he asked me, do you love me more than you love your kids? And this time it just kind of rolled off my tongue quicker because, I adore my kids. Like, I would die for my kids. We currently have 8 kids. We just adopted 4 kids just over a year ago. But if any one of my 8 kids needed my heart, I would give it to them. So I said, I love my kids more than I love you. And then he asked me, do you love me more than you love the Denver Broncos? Which is kind of a funny question, but before I really answered that with my heart, I had to think about it. I thought, I just watched my team for 3 hours straight. As you know, that's what a lot of Americans do, and people all across the world, right? They watch their team for hours on end, and every Sunday I did that, and I thought to myself, I've never spent 3 hours alone with God ever. Like, I'd never prayed for 3 straight hours. I had never read my Bible for 3 straight hours. And I do this thing every single Sunday. Sometimes, as you know, we watch 2 games and we'll spend 6 or 7 hours, and it's crazy. And so, I wondered to myself, do I really love God? So that night I remember, going to bed and laying in bed with my wife. We have this thing where we just kind of hold hands and we're staring up at the ceiling in the dark, and we're talking, and I'm telling her about this conversation I had. And I made a commitment that night to stop praying. And I stopped praying for my business. We owned a couple of very successful small businesses. I stopped praying for my health. I stopped praying for my safety, like anything that was personal. I traded all my personal prayers for one 4-word prayer. And that 4-word prayer, for an entire year, I prayed, I love you, God. God, I love you. And that was it for an entire year. So, anytime that I felt like praying for myself, which, praying for health, wealth, and prosperity, I traded it out and I just said, God, I love you. And so I did that for a year. That was November of 2010. The following November in 2011, I found myself in Guatemala. It was my very first missions trip. And it was actually just myself. My wife stayed home at the time. We had 4 kids. And so she stayed home while I got to go to Guatemala City. There was no huge call from God to go to Guatemala City or anything like that. I just really felt like that's something I wanted to do at that point in my life. I remember.
Did you go with a group, or did you just?
Yeah, I did. Actually, we went with our church. I went with our church. And there was a group of probably, weirdly, so this is kind of side note, I think there were about 20 of us, maybe 18, something like that. Of the 18 people, myself and 2 other families, so my family and then the other 2 families, they moved to Guatemala to be missionaries almost exactly a year later. And we all, from that one trip, which is really super weird, it just doesn't happen. So anyway, I find myself on this missions trip, and I remember walking in the back door. We went to serve at this orphanage, but I remember walking in the back door of this feeding center. We spent one afternoon at a feeding center, and there were a sea of kids. There was like 200 kids. So in November, there's no school in November in Guatemala, and so there was just packed with kids. I remember walking in the back and just seeing them all kind of just shuffling around. And at some point, the praise and worship starts up, and they start playing their music and singing. And as soon as the praise and worship started up, every kid, they all stood up and they started clapping and singing along. And within a few minutes, half of the kids are putting their hands in the air and they are just praising God. It was unbelievable. These kids are poor. This is probably the only meal they're going to eat that day, poor. I remember standing at the back of the room and watching these kids, and I realized, wow, they love God. And you could not just see it, but you just feel it. You could feel the Holy Spirit just like pouring into that room. And it was on that day, watching those kids, that I realized I loved God too. I remember God telling me that day, I don't want you on Sundays. And I don't want you when you have time. I want all of you. Follow me. And 7 months later, my family and I sold our house. So we were living in our dream house in this little town, Windsor, Colorado. We had built the house. We owned two, like I said, successful small businesses. We had sold everything. 7 months later, we were moving to Guatemala. And here's the crazy thing. I remember, so two small kind of side notes to that story is, on the way to Guatemala, I remember checking in at the Denver International Airport at the front desk, and the lady, just kind of a funny story, the lady is like, "Oh, Mr. Sisneros, it looks like you have been upgraded to first class. And so I just want to make sure that you're okay with that." And I had no idea, because I generally don't travel. And so I'm like, well, sure. I was kind of freaked out because I didn't know if I had to pay more or whatever. And so I said, yeah, that sounds great. So I sat in first class from Denver to Dallas. And then in Dallas, we're waiting for our connecting flight. I go up to the front desk again, kind of like, thinking, wow, would that be cool? And so I get to the front desk, same thing. The attendant's like, "Mr. Sisneros, it looks like you've been bumped to first class. Would you like to fly first class today?" I'm like, yes. This time I was like, I mean, let me just tell you, if you ever have the chance to fly first class for free, especially, I would do it, because it was just cool. It was fun. And so anyway, we get to Guatemala. This crazy thing happens to me at this feeding center. My wife is not with me. And so we're coming back. I am not thinking about first class at all. It is the farthest thing from my mind. And I go to the front desk in Guatemala City. We're flying back to Dallas. And again, "Mr. Cisneros, you've been bumped up to first class." And so on the way back, it was weird because there were only two of us in first class. And everybody else, were basically back in the cattle car of regular seats. And I remember, because I was on one side and there was a lady on the other side, and I had my sunglasses on, and I sat near the window, and I just bawled to myself. I wasn't crying out loud, but I just had tears streaming down my face, realizing what was going on. Because I promise you that when I left to Guatemala, I had zero chance of becoming a missionary. Like, there is no way we would become missionaries, zero chance. And now here I am, 6 days later, going back to Colorado, sitting on this plane, just bawling my eyes out, and realizing that we're going to sell everything, and also realizing that I've got to talk to my wife about this. And I basically just made this deal. I'm like, "Listen, I'll go, but you got to talk to my wife." So you can imagine that, as a missionary, that those types of things, you just remember all the details, right? I remember getting home from that missions trip. I remember, we got in late. I think it was like 11 o'clock, and driving home in the snow. It had just snowed. Walking up to my front door, and I actually had the only tracks in the snow. Opened the front door. Of course, everybody's in bed. My wife came down and met me at the door. Walked upstairs and just gave all the kids, just kind of woke them up, and I said, "I'm home." Gave them the kiss on the cheek, and then went to bed with my wife. And we're laying there, and I'm telling her about this week, and then I'm telling her about this conversation. Gosh, it's just so emotional just thinking about it. But and we're laying there, and we're holding hands, and we're staring into the ceiling. And I told her, what God was asking. And it was silent. And then she just said one word, and all she said was, "Okay." And that was it. Like, there was really no conversation. This is how crazy it was. is we got up the next day, talking to the kids, and I think there were like 9, 10, 11 ish in that age range. Maybe it was 9, 10, and 12. And we're talking to the kids, and that day, the next day, we told our kids what we were doing. The next day, we called a real estate agent, and this was now like December 2nd, I think. And so we decided to put our house on the market after New Year's, after Christmas and New Year's. We put our house on the market early January, and we landed in Guatemala City 7 months later on July 12th. And that was the first time my wife had ever been to Guatemala, my wife and kids. And we have, she's still on her first missions trip, her first visit here. And so we've been here. So that's our story.
Have you guys been back in the States since?
We have. So we actually, for the first year, we decided to stay in Guatemala in Guatemala for a year and a half, so that we would allow our kids to kind of get acclimated to the country and just kind of get settled in. Because if we took them back, every 6 months, might be harder for them to get used to it. And so our kids were actually, crying. They didn't know what was going on, and I told them, I said, listen, if we're going to go for a year, and if this is not working out, and we'll have a family meeting, and if this doesn't work out, we will come back. And not only will we come back, because we sold everything, dude. So when we come back, we'll give you $500 to kind of rebuy the stuff that we're selling. And that kind of made these little kids, 9, 10, 11 years old. Yeah. So they're like, okay. So they were cool with that. And then a year later, we sat down. We actually are one of those, TV families that we actually have family meetings. We sat down with them, and they joked around at first, like, no, we want to go back. Where's the money? But then they're like, no, we don't. We love it. We want to stay. And so I don't even remember what your question was, but there you go.
I have a few other questions with that, actually. First off, I'm really interested on why Guatemala, because, that's really interesting in my story is why Brazil, so I'm interested in that. Second, about your children. It's one thing to go to do missions with yourself, another thing to do it with your wife. It's a whole nother ball game going to do missions with your children, and putting them in that culture, speaking another language, all those different things. So how did you overcome that? First answer the question with why Guatemala?
So really, Guatemala is where I felt God was calling us. And here's the thing with our story, the truth of the matter is, and it's still this way today, we're kind of on this need to know basis. Like, he's like, follow me. And we're like, okay. So we did. Matter of fact, when we decided, we're like, okay, let's go, we're going to be missionaries, we had zero idea what that even meant. Like, all of a sudden we realized, how are we going to live? Like, do we keep our businesses in the States going? Like, what do we do? We were just being obedient. And so, and I really believe, Dallas, that really our obedience has made all the difference in everything that we've done, and every part of this ministry. We just keep saying yes, and he keeps moving us forward. So that's we just felt called to Guatemala. We felt like that's where he called us.
Yeah. And the second, with your children there, first off, did your children learn Spanish as soon as they got there, or things like that?
Yeah, so I actually have I have ancestry from Mexico as well as Spain, but my parents never spoke Spanish to us. It was just one of those things back in when I was born. It was a bad thing to speak Spanish in the United States, and so we never learned. I never learned. I didn't know Spanish. My wife is blonde hair, blue eyed. She didn't know Spanish. And not that matters, but so my kids didn't know Spanish. I think they knew like taco and burrito, things like that, but that's pretty much it. So we got to Guatemala, and we got here August 12th. So mid-August, maybe a week or 10 days later, was the beginning of school. And so there's a missionary kids school in Guatemala City that we enrolled our kids in. My wife volunteered there. And during that year of school, they took Spanish classes directly from Guatemalan nationals, which was really cool. At the end of 1 year, they almost knew no Spanish. Like it was just like the States. You take language classes in the States, and after 3 years, you're fortunate to find the bathroom. So we decided at this point, obviously our ministry is starting to get going, and so at this point we realized, listen, in order for them to be effective and for us to be effective, we have to get serious about learning Spanish. I actually was studying Spanish and learning it. But we enrolled our kids in a Guatemalan school. It was a private school, but it was a Guatemalan school where they just speak Spanish. And so in one semester, all three of my kids were fluent. And to this day, they actually they all speak better than I do.
That's crazy. I love it.
But dude, let me tell you, it was brutal. Like, it was absolutely brutal. Like, someone came home crying every day. And some days they all came home crying. They were, bullied because they were different and from another country and all that stuff. So it was hard. I'm not going to lie.
It's hard. I want to cry every day, living in Brazil and not speaking Portuguese, and living in Asia and not speaking Thai or Khmer. But the good thing about Spanish and Portuguese compared to English, it's the same alphabet,
Yep.
Where in Asia, it's completely different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I totally get where they're coming from. I couldn't imagine going to school where it's only speaking Portuguese for me. Like, that's insane. So
it was sink or swim. Like, we basically threw them into the deep end, but they are so grateful. They have multiple times told us throughout the years, we're so grateful for that.
And I know it's difficult to speak for your children, but with your family meetings that you have,
Yep.
do they consider themselves as missionaries as well, or just children who are parents are missionaries?
So it's kind of this ebb and flow. So right now, my two boys, and actually all three of my kids were part of leadership at youth group at our church. And so they were, part of that. I don't think they would consider that necessarily missions work, but they're learning to be leaders. And so now just my two sons are doing it. My daughter has graduated from high school and she's working on writing and kind of trying to figure out where to go next. She does want to serve. She's looking at maybe India or Africa. And so, she's got plans. She would like to get into maybe India with like a teaching degree or a nursing degree, something. She'll need something like that. So she's considering those options. But no, I don't, I think it would be, here's the thing, Dallas, is, and this is just for you to consider also, just, as one day you'll get married and you'll have kids, and just, it's so important. And this is brutally important, is we really felt like our first ministry that God gave us was when we were in the States, and that was to raise our kids to know and love Jesus. And so for us to come here and change priorities didn't make sense. And so they have always been our priority and our first ministry. And so we are just raising them. And let me tell you, man, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging. Man, my kids, they love God. They love Jesus. My son, my oldest son, he graduates from high school this year. His gap year, he's going to be, he's applied for, I'm sure he'll be going to David Platt, his radical gap year. And so he'll spend, I think it's like 9 months in Virginia, and then they actually fly to a country somewhere in Asia where they've never heard the gospel, and they spend a month doing that and sharing the gospel. But they'll spend 9 months learning about missionary work and missions and stuff like that. So yeah, man, it's your kids can't help but just get surrounded and saturated with the Holy Spirit, when they see it. Now, let me tell you this, they participate all the time. A lot of times they will translate for teams that come to visit us. They multiple times have gone with me, and we're praying over someone who's sick, or delivering food to a family that, is kind of in a crisis situation. So they're big participants, but I don't know that they would consider themselves missionaries, but they are definitely like missionaries in training.
That's really interesting. I like it. I think it's difficult to raise children that love Jesus these days. Like, yes, it's amazing. And I think you're right. That's our first calling, is we're supposed to raise our children to love Jesus. But so many times we have preachers' children, and missionary children who definitely go the other way, and so I think it's an amazing thing when those children love Jesus just like their parents.
Absolutely.
I think it's really important. And next question. So in Guatemala, you've been there for about 7 years. So once you got there and kind of got the children acclimated to the culture, started learning Spanish, what next? What happened next?
Wow. So I think it took a little while to shake my Americanism off, my American Christianity off. And what I mean by
I
that,
definitely understand what you're saying by that.
yeah. So here's the deal, man. I got to Guatemala. My kids are off. We got them settled. We were settled into this little house. They're off to school. My wife's off to school, and I am again. We're just on a need to know basis, and I'm praying to God. And what I wanted to do, and if it was up to me, I was going to put all of our luggage in like one room and run out the front door and like build a house for some poor family, or go feed some people, or go, do something. I just felt like I needed to do something, because as Americans, we like want to accomplish stuff and we want to check things off our list. And I thought, I say this jokingly, but I kind of had this feeling like, man, give me like 2 years and I will like take care of Guatemala, and then we can find another country, And so I'm praying about it and praying about it. My wife's praying with me. And this is what kept coming back. And I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure? But what kept coming back was, I want you to spend time with me. Like, remember, I just spent an entire year, telling God I love him, and falling, really what it came down to was falling in love with God for the first time. And so now he's like, just spend time with me and learn Spanish. And so, dude, think about this. And I feel your pain, but for 6 months, all I did was read the Bible, pray, and study Spanish for 6 months straight, which we came about 65% financially supported with some savings from selling our businesses. And so can you imagine these donors? They're like, so like, what's going on? But in 6 months, and that's all I was doing. No one questioned it. Everyone trusted it. And I didn't know at the time, I didn't understand the value of that, but that was the whole deal. Like, that was everything. And so again, it just came down to just being obedient, because if it was up to me, I wouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
we get to, so now this, we got there in July. So in January, I started visiting this village that is out in the mountains of Guatemala, and just getting to know people. I met the principal of the school, and it was crazy because in the beginning we had no resources. As a matter of fact, we were draining our savings every single month, and it was a big hole, and it was draining fast. And we knew we had about 2 years of savings to go along with our support that we're going to run dry at some point. But all we had to offer, which again was just amazing love by Jesus, all we had was prayer. And so we would just get to know people, and we're like, how can we pray for you? And then we would hear, then before you know it, people are like, hey, could you guys come pray for my grandma, or could you guys come pray for my husband, or whatever. And so that's kind of how it started. We just started out, praying for people. So that's how that built up who we were. That told people who we were. We were here to just pray for people. And I mean, crazy as it is, we saw actual miracles. Like, we saw people who should have died live. And it was a really cool time of ministry. It was really just everything that you would hope it would be. It was just beautiful. And so we at some point, I want to say it was like that July, we started. It was the middle of the school year, and we now were pretty clear that God had called us to Guatemala to raise boys to be men of God, to make disciples. We felt that if we were to teach, some of the older men in the community and teach them the Word of God, that it would just be harder, they have more habits that are harder to change, and they've got busy lives. And so we just were like, okay, let's go to the beginning. Let's raise them up from a younger age. And so again, we didn't know why, but we just started doing that. So we started a boys academy, which is basically an after school program where we had about 80 boys come throughout the week. We started out actually at the elementary school, where we would teach them, we would feed them a hot meal. We would teach them a short Bible lesson, kind of a kid Bible lesson. And then we would help them with their homework, and we play soccer. And that was kind of what we did for that first year. And just kind of going along, just teaching these Bible basics. And we eventually, after that first year, we moved into a little rented house, this tiny little brick home that was miserably hot and really loud when it rained. But that's what we had. And so we rented it. I think it was like $50 a month. And we just kept doing that. We did that for 4 years. So we're at the end of 4 years. We now had, so we were teaching 3rd through 6th graders. And so now our 3rd graders were graduating from the 6th grade. And I remember, Dallas, that I was on my way back. By the way, I've never gotten bumped to first class. I think God was like, yeah, man, it's going to be this way every time. It's never been that way. So we're on our way back to Colorado for some fundraising. And my wife and I are talking, and she's like, so listen, we've been doing this for 4 years. Like, are we raising boys to be men of God? Like, is this where we're supposed to be? And it was just so devastating because the answer was no. Like, these kids that were graduating from the 6th grade, really just like, they were kids, and they weren't men of God in any way, shape, or form. And it was just so frustrating. And so we were on our knees and we're looking for guidance. God, we know this is what you want us to do. You need to show us the way. So what we ended up doing is establishing and building a private Christian middle school. So middle school in Guatemala is 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And the reason we did that was for one class. And so every morning at 8 a.m. till 9 a.m., we have Bible study. That's the first class of the day. It's the longest class of the day. All the classes are 45 minutes. Bible is an hour to an hour and 15 minutes every morning. And we teach the Bible. And then they have math and science, and we feed them lunch and snacks and all that stuff. And we have some amazing teachers. So at the end of the first year, so now every year in October, we go back to Colorado to do some fundraising for projects that we're doing, and like building a middle school and a clinic and other things. So we're on the plane, and again, my wife's like, so do you think now at the end of 3 years that these boys will be ready to go out and truly seek after God? And I said, babe, I think that there are some right now in 1 year that are ready to go out and that are actually seeking after God. Like, it was crazy. So you have to understand, in the beginning, they're getting maybe 15 minutes or half an hour a week of like this kid Bible study. So what we decided to do is we teach directly from the Bible. We don't have any kind of, teenage, I don't know, curriculum, how to be a good kid, all we do is read directly out of the Bible. And as a matter of fact, these last 2 years, we read through the book of Luke. It took us 2 years studying Luke every single morning. It took us 2 years to get through the book of Luke. So we go pretty deep. Like, some days I'll go in with this, long message, that covers, 2 or 3 pages, and I end up reading, one scripture, one verse, and we spend an hour on that, just praying over and talking about and learning from God about that one verse. And dude, I wish I could bottle this and share with people, like, when God shows up, when the Holy Spirit shows up and does the teaching, and I feel like I'm just there listening. I've prepared this whole lesson, and God just comes in and it's like, yeah, but this is what we're going to learn today. It's just, it's just amazing. It's something that I'm super humbled to be a part of.
It's a good plumb line, really. I mean, why mess around with other curriculum criteria when you could just teach out of the Bible, and you're raising disciples?
The thing is, I think American churches, I think Americans in general don't give kids enough credit. Like these middle school kids are like soaking in it. Like, dude, the things that they have learned. So at the end of this 3 years, we had our first graduating class. That was 3 years ago. So we just had our first graduating class. At the end of that, I'm like, okay, what have you learned in 3 years? I wanted to make a list of things they had learned. It was mind blowing. Like I left that day, and it ended up being 3 days. I thought, okay, let's talk about what have you learned without opening your Bible. Just what have you learned in 3 years? And we did that for 3 days in a row, and because they just kept telling me all these different things. And the first day I left, I came home, and I don't know where my family was, but it was just me, and I just sat in our living room, and I was just wanted to cry. I was just unbelievably emotional. And so we don't give our kids, listen, these teen devotionals, we researched it. We didn't know. We originally were like, okay, and go to the internet sometime, look for like teen curriculum for, teaching the Bible or teen devotionals, go to Amazon. There's nothing out there. It's all crap. Really, at the end of the day, it's just really not very good stuff. And so we just trusted God with the Bible, of course, right? And we're like, there's some things like, the first year we actually learned about, men of the Bible, and we read a lot of, of the Old Testament, and we learned, Abraham and Isaac. And I mean, there's some stuff that goes on in the Old Testament with, daughters and dads and stuff that goes on. We just studied right through it. I literally am like a couple times, I'm like, man, do we do this? Do we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah? How do we do this? And then at the end of the day, it was perfect, and they could handle it, and God took care of it. And yeah.
And you created these things called safe houses.
No. So what the deal is? It's actually kind of an anomaly. It's not something that normally happens. But so we actually are partnered with another missionary couple. They're from Colorado. They came out and they lived with us for a year and a half. And at the end of that year and a half, they're like, yeah, you know what? We're going to start this nutrition program, things like that. So anyway, they actually have been working out of our clinic, which is below. We live above the clinic. They've been working out of that clinic for the last year and a half, 2 years. And one of the young moms who was in that program with her son. So her son was malnourished. He had scabies, and he was a health mess. And so they were working with the clinic. And one day, Carly called me up, and she said, "Hey, could you come down? I have a question for you." So I went down, and she basically explained that this young girl who was in her program, that it wasn't her husband, but the baby's daddy, and they were living together. She said that her husband is threatening her, and he said that he's going to chop her up into pieces. So he's an alcoholic. He's going to chop her up into pieces and throw her into a well, and nobody would ever find her. So she came to us seeking help. And so we said, listen, you can't go home. We are going to find a safe place for you. So we made a bunch of calls, and by the end of the day, we had a place for her. And we told her, listen, there's this place in Guatemala City called The Refuge, where there's some other missionaries that work there. You can go stay there. They'll help you through this. They have counseling, and they have, obviously daycare, and they have a room for you and your son and all this stuff. So, we're excited about it, and we're telling her about this. And she said, well, I'm going to give him one more chance. And then if he does it again, I'll go. And of course, we're just like, ugh, like we know what that means. Yeah. So, Carly is actually, she was an emergency room nurse in Colorado. And so she had seen this before, and she's like, Heidi, listen, if you do this, I've worked in the emergency room, and when the girls come back, they're beat up, and then she just told her, or they're dead. So, I really want to encourage you to go to Guatemala City. So she didn't. She went back home, and then I think it was like 2 days later, Carly had left. She and her husband went back to the United States just for a couple of weeks, and our neighbor called and said, "Hey, Heidi would like to talk to you." And I went and I talked to Heidi, and she said, hey, I want to go. And she had talked about suicide. She said she wants to kill herself and she wanted to kill her son. And she said, so I'm worried and I want to go to this safe house. So anyway, we took her to the safe house, and she, long story short, she spent 8 months there, and it was absolutely amazing. She literally just left the safe house about, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And so we've helped her get set up at her mom's in a room, and, getting her set up with beds and clothes and things like that. So she's doing really, really well. I'm super proud of her. But, things like that, that's clearly has nothing to do with our middle school. But that, as you know, as a missionary, that stuff just happens all the time. It's like, we live in this tiny little village in the mountains of Guatemala. And so people are at our door, periodically. So.
Wow. Incredible. And you said that you have adopted 4 children from Guatemala.
Yeah, dude. Wow. So, how do I say this? So it's been a year. So November last year is when we adopted them, and they're 4 siblings. Their dad was abusive, and as a matter of fact, he was, last time we knew, in court for trying to sell a daughter from another marriage, trying to sell her. And they're both alcoholics, and had given the 2 older kids away, and so all this stuff. So anyway, we were able to adopt them a year ago, and I don't even know how to say this other than in all the time we've been in Guatemala, and I can say in all of my life, I have never felt like the scripture, deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me, like I do with these 4 kids. It is, I mean, you want it to be this like huge romantic thing, and let me spoil it for you. It is really awesome and romantic, and it's beautiful now. But the first 3 months, the first week, I remember waking up thinking, there's no way we're going to do this, because there was all kinds of emotional problems. And I mean, I can't even tell you, but we're like, I don't know how we're going to survive this. I'm not even kidding. I didn't know if we could survive this. And so a week goes by, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And at the end of the first month, I'm thinking, there's no way we're going to survive this. Yet there we were surviving it. And then I think in about 3 months, it started to change a little bit. And there was just like this little bit of improvement, and a little bit more trust on their side and a little bit more trust on our side. And we just kept loving them, because they were like these incredibly empty tanks. And we just kept pouring in. And as much as we would pour in, it would just drain back out. And, here we are a year later, and I can't even tell you the incredible joy and happiness that we all have. It's just, it's amazing. I mean, listen, they're still kids, and, we now have, so I have an older daughter who's a nurse, and she lives in Colorado. She's 29 years old. But in this house, we have 7 kids. 3 of them are teenagers. So can you imagine, we're getting ready to like empty the clip, and we reload, and we've got 4 little ones, and we adopted them. They were 2, 4, 5, and 6, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but so they're little kids, they're little ones. And, but thank God, because listen, if we wouldn't have adopted them, I can 100% say that they would have lived a life in an institution, and they would have had incredible, well, our daughter was born deaf. So nobody even knew until she got to the orphanage, where we found her that she was deaf. And so she eventually got a cochlear implant that someone had raised the money for. And so she's in therapy every single day. We meet with a private therapist twice a week, and she's finally able to express herself, and the incredible joy that she has from that. And it is, I say this a lot. I'm like, man, that may be the reason God brought us to Guatemala, was for those 4 kids. But then I'll say, yeah, but maybe it was for Wilson, who had this heart problem that nobody noticed for, I don't know, 5 years. and end up getting him a heart surgery, a desperate heart surgery, and end up his life ends up being saved. And we're like, maybe we came for Wilson, or maybe we came for Heidi, who may have, it's like, but that's the way it feels. It's like, it's been an amazing trip, man.
It sounds incredible. It sounds like you've had a lot of journey in the last 8 years. And for your timeline, I know that God doesn't always reveal things to us, but just for you and your wife and maybe for your family, how long do you feel that you'd like to be in the mission field in Guatemala?
Well, so we're kind of on this need to know basis. We have to be here for at least a couple of years. Regarding the adoption, you have to stay in country for a while. So that's for sure. Mm-hmm. We don't have plans to leave, but I will say that since we've gotten here, our hope and our goal is to raise up local Guatemalans to be able to take over this ministry, and that we would be able to go and either do something like this or do whatever else God calls us to do. I can say this: we'll be missionaries forever. We won't ever go back and get jobs and live in the quote unquote world. So we'll always be missionaries. I don't know what that looks like or what that means, but we have right now, I think there's 10 people working in this ministry, 10 Guatemalans. And so the Bible study for the young kids, we still have the elementary program that is taught by and run by a Guatemalan. Pretty much everything except for English class, which I teach twice a week, but I am working on getting that transferred over. We actually have a Guatemalan who is fluent in like 5 languages. He's just amazing. And then the only thing left is teaching Bible in the morning. And until God reveals someone to me, until somebody steps up, and it might be somebody that we're growing right now. It might be somebody in our ministry, like in our boys academy, who is going to graduate. And we've been open to that. So we don't know what that looks like, but that's really the last piece, because we don't want to be the guy. God is the guy. And so we just want to be obedient, and we want to do it in a healthy, loving way. So
yeah, I absolutely understand. George, it's been amazing to speak with you. It's been amazing to hear your story, hear your testimony, hear how God has changed your life and your children's life and the people who you've been working with in Guatemala.
Well, listen, man, it's always, for me, it's always just, I'm excited to brag about God and everything that He's been doing, and all the glory to Him. We feel humbled and privileged to be here doing what we're doing.
And just for our listeners, if there's a way that they can research you, a way that they can find you, do you have a website, social media platforms? How can they contact you?
Yeah. So listen, if people want to reach out to us, or if they have any additional questions or anything like that, we just love sharing, like I said, what God is doing. And so you can go to our website, our ministry page. It is Ordinary Missionaries. So just regular ordinarymissionaries.org. And you can find us on Facebook under the same name, Ordinary Missionaries. You can find us on Instagram under the same name, ordinary_missionaries. But and sign up for our newsletter. We would love to keep in touch with you. We send out a newsletter probably once every 3 weeks. So it's kind of more like a newsletter snack. And I would love to answer any questions and really just encourage people. So here's the whole goal of our newsletter is to encourage people in their walk with God. So I want them to be able to say, wow, like this guy from Colorado who is not a pastor, he's never, had training as a pastor or Bible. And here's a guy that is following God, and he's doing it in a way that's just being obedient. That's it. And if he can do it, I can do it. And you certainly don't have to come to Guatemala, and you certainly don't, really, in my opinion, I don't feel like you have to leave the United States. I think, honestly, the United States is in need of missionaries as well, because I think that maybe we're off course a bit in some areas. So,
yeah. Thank you so much, George, for being a part of the podcast today.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Dallas. And if you wouldn't, I don't know if you can put maybe in the show notes just a link to our website and maybe our email or something like that.
Yep, I have that. And George, to be able to end the podcast, would you be able to pray us out?
Absolutely. I would love to. All right. Father, we love you. Thank you for this day. Thank you for trusting us with this ministry. Direct our steps, Lord. Put the people in front of us that you want us to love. Open our eyes and just make it super clear to us. Make it obvious that they are the person that you want us to love today. We can't do this without you. We can't do life without you. We can't do ministry without you. God, thank you for blessing this time that I had with Dallas. I pray for him and the work that he's doing there, and that he would be able to continue to glorify you in your name, Lord. May it always be all about you. Keep us humble and continue to break our hearts. We love you, Lord. In your name, amen.
Amen.
You've just listened to the Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast with your host, Pastor Chris Busher. Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast was recorded live in studio with final editing made before uploading. Subscribe today to Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast on iTunes or Google Play. For more fantastic daily content, visit Pastor Chris Busher online via Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Don't miss the next episode on Faith and Family Fellowship Podcast.